to be claimed. That is an important part. 9 times out of 10, when these people were accused of being witches and they hung, the property was claimed by the sheriff of Salem, I believe, and possibly by other members of Salem too. Also, she was not afraid to speak her mind. She was constantly arguing with her husband and entertaining guests until late. And for reasons unknown, her sister's brother also testified against her, claiming he saw her talking with the devil. This may have been more bribery, but there's no evidence of this. Within 8 days of her arrest, she was taken to the gallows and executed. It is said she was still protesting her innocence right up until the very end. And next on my list I have Martha Corey. Now, Martha Corey was dragged before the people of Salem to be judged. Surprisingly, she was a constant churchgoer. She was a kind-hearted woman. She didn't believe in the witch trials, and she didn't think that they would be going ahead. She thought they were ridiculous, and it was all poppycock. Especially the accusations made by the young girls. She thought it was all obvious that they were lying. This may have been the reason she was condemned to death. She was quickly convicted of being a witch. She begged the judge to see through these lies from these silly girls. The girls put on quite a show, mimicking her every movement as though Martha was controlling them with magic. And then they claimed that they saw a small man talking into Martha's ear that no one else could see, and they also claimed that there was a small yellow bird sucking on her hand that no one else could see. Now, you cannot deny the imagination of these girls to simply pluck a lie like this out of thin air and fabricate a story like this. And amazingly, this was enough to condemn the woman and sentence her to death. And it is believed that this was a message from the Putmans. Some believe that they were saying, don't doubt the Salem Witch Trials, don't doubt what we are doing, or there will be consequences. Or they were simply saying that if you defy God's will to execute a witch, you will be executed yourself. Next, we have a 80-year-old man named Giles Corey. Now, you remember I said it wasn't only women who were accused of being witches, it was also men who were accused of being wizards. Now, as you might have guessed, Giles Corey was the husband to Martha Corey, who was sentenced to death. Now, it's said that apparently Giles did believe that his wife was a witch. He believed everything they were saying about her. He didn't support her one little bit. But then one day, out of the blue, he was also accused of being a witch or a wizard. From this moment on, as you can imagine, he swore his innocence and his wife's innocence, saying that there was some kind of big mistake. But this didn't matter anymore. Let me just give you a little bit more information about Corey. Apparently, years before the Salem Witch Trials, he actually took the life of another man. Now, granted, the other man he took the life of was a slave. Apparently he had beat him too much and he had passed away, but still he had taken another man's life, and this would play a part in the evidence that was given by the accusers. You see, one day, as Corey was trying to convince the court of his innocence, as the girls tended to do, they started to thrash about and scream and yell. And all of a sudden, they claimed that they had been visited by the ghosts of a murdered man. And many people took this to be the truth because Corey had actually murdered someone. Now, how the girls knew this is unsure. Maybe they had been planted this information because it did happen some years before the Salem Witch Trials. Or maybe, just maybe, they had heard the rumours around town. But whichever way this went down, it didn't help him one little bit, and they were both sentenced to death, him and his wife. But his death sentence was a little bit different to hanging because, you see, Giles Corey pleaded his innocence right up until the very end, and he refused trial. Now, once again, the girls had claimed that they had seen the spectral form of Giles Corey, and he had visited them in the night and tried to get them to sign the Devil's Book. And they also claimed Corey visited in spectral form and inflicted pain upon them. And they described him as a dreadful wizard. And guess what? He had showed disgust in the trials before his arrest. And he had been a member of the Porter faction of Salem Town Church and didn't support, you guessed it, the Putman faction. Now, Corey and his wife were placed into prison before their execution for a whole 5 months. Meanwhile, a lot of evidence came forward stating that he had been seen mixing with witches and more lies. Corey knew if he faced a trial that he would be found guilty and lose his property. So in an attempt to save his property, which probably failed anyway, he refused trial. And he always claimed his innocence. Punishment for refusing trial was to be crushed to death on the big heavy stones. On Monday the 19th of September, he was stripped naked. A board was placed on his chest as people watched. The executioner would place one by one heavy rocks on top of the board where the old man lied underneath. And then he would place another and another. And it said Corey screamed out in agony for more weight just to make his death that more quicker. And this little detail is quite horrible. Now, it is reported that during the execution, as he was being crushed to death, Corey's tongue bulged out of his mouth, and the sheriff forced it back in with the end of his cane as he died. It's believed that Corey's death may have started opposition towards the trials when people witnessed the very cruel execution and started to wise up. Next we have George Burrows, who was implicated as ringleader to all the other witches. George had recently lived in Salem but left some years before over a money dispute by, you guessed it, the Putmans. He left Salem and eventually settled in Wells, Maine, and he was granted 150 acres of land. He ministered in Maine for a whole 9 years, and then one day out of the blue he was taken from his dinner table and arrested and taken back to Salem. One of his accusers, who just so happened to be a relative of the Putmans, claimed once again a spectral image visited them and told them that he was worse than a witch, and he was a conjurer, and he ruled all the other witches. One girl claimed that he gave her magical dolls, whilst another girl claimed that he took her atop a mountain and showed her the entire kingdom below the earth, and said that she would have all this if she just signed the Book of the Devil. They also made more ridiculous claims against George, claiming that he could run at superhuman speed and he was freakishly strong. They also claimed that they were visited by 2 of his dead wife's ghosts, who claimed that he killed them both. George was believed to be a very nice man, and he was generous, even giving some of his land back to his hometown. He was respected and loved, and apparently 32 respectable citizens signed a petition to swear his innocence. And it said that one of the accusers recounted their accusation, and believe me, this was quite common, and normally they said they did it out of fear. But sadly, it was all for nothing. It was no use. This kind-hearted man was taken to the gallows. As he stood waiting for the noose, he shouted out the whole Lord's Prayer. This was supposed to be impossible to do if indeed you was a witch or a wizard, but he did it perfectly. The crowd started to shout for George to be pardoned. They could now see his innocence. He had just recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. However, it did George no good. He was hanged right there before the crowd as they protested his innocence. Next, we have Murray Easty. Murray was another poor soul who faced the accusations of the young girls. The same as before, the girls made accusations of spectral visitations and started having fits. It was all becoming the norm, and maybe people were starting to wise up to it all. On this occasion, the girls even went as far as to claim that their necks were broken and an enormous weight was felt upon their necks. And the only way to relieve this pain that they were being inflicted was to stretch out Murray's neck, in other words, hang her. Amazingly, despite all of this, Murray was released and allowed to go home to her husband and children. The afflicted girls didn't seem to like this though, and they seemed determined to see her back in the courtroom. They started to say that they had been visited by Murray's spectral form, and they were strangled in their beds and they experienced fits. And sadly, Murray was then taken from her own bed where she slept and taken away to be locked up. She begged them to reconsider, but it fell on deaf ears. Eventually, after 12 days in prison, Murray was hanged. Next, we have Rebecca Nurse. 71-year-old Rebecca Nurse was another woman accused of witchcraft for no reason at all, apart from the usual spectral visitations and trying to get the girls to sign the devil's book. The strange thing is about Rebecca is that she was considered a saint. She attended church on a regular basis. No one knows why she was accused of being a witch. Apparently she was a lovely woman. I have actually heard a story where Rebecca apparently traded harsh words with a neighbour when the neighbour's pigs came onto her property and did some damage. I've also heard another story which was very similar. The pigs came onto her property and then the neighbour later died of mysterious causes. Now I don't know which one of those is true, but I did hear both, so I thought I'd include them both here for you. Now apparently many believe that this nice old lady did not belong in court, and there was an actual petition brought forward to get her freed, and it actually worked. She was found not guilty. But wait, the girls all started shrieking and thrashing in pain. The judge demanded that the jury think twice and consider something Rebecca had said during the trial. Now this wasn't unheard of in those days, this was a common practice. Apparently during the trial, Rebecca had been asked a question about another witch. Rebecca was hard of hearing, and she misheard the question and gave an answer that ultimately condemned her. I was trying to decipher the mix-up, and I believe it went something along these lines. Rebecca had been asked about a fellow witch. She had misheard the question and answered, yes, she's one of us. But Mary was meaning one of us as in prisoner, not witch. And then when she was asked to explain herself, sadly this time Rebecca missed the whole question. She simply did not hear the question, so she didn't answer, and her silence was taken as guilt. It was this ridiculous mix-up by an old lady that could barely hear that sentenced her to death. Her family tried in vain to explain the mix-up, but as usual it was no good. It fell on deaf ears, and Rebecca was hanged. It's believed this may have been due to more Putman hatred, and on top of this, Rebecca also had expensive property that could be claimed. Over the period of the Salem Witch Trials, it is believed that over 200 people were accused of being a witch. 25 of them were killed. 5 died in jail, 19 were hanged, and there was a poor man who was crushed to death under all of the rocks. And there was also 2 dogs who were executed after claims that they had the devil inside them. Now, as I mentioned before, as this madness went on and on, people eventually started to protest to the trials, and they tried in vain to get them stopped. But it just seemed to keep going. I think the public were finally beginning to see that the girls making the accusations were nothing but delinquent juveniles, doing it out of boredom or possibly being forced into it. But it would seem that they didn't have a shred of human decency between them. It is believed that the girls may have all banded together before the trials to think up lies and accusations, or they were, like I said before, forced into saying these things and to act out fits or insanity on demand. But let me tell you what stopped the Salem Witch Trials once and for all. In 1963, the governor of the colony ended the trials, but only because his wife was accused of being a witch. How ironic. And just like that, it was over. Over the coming years, some of the girls would come forward and apologise for their actions, some still claiming the devil made them do it. All the victims' families were eventually compensated, but to be honest, this could never ever be enough. If you've seen your family member hanged for being a witch, this would never be enough, and the compensation that was given to them was minuscule. It would seem, in the end, the witch trials were a cruel prank played by bored children, or maybe a bigger conspiracy was afoot involving some influential members of Salem, or maybe it was all down to the Puritans trying their best to cleanse Salem of people who didn't fit in with their religious ways. Or maybe, just maybe, one night in 1692 the devil did indeed ride into Salem on a dark steed and plant dark seeds into the minds of the people of Salem, and start one of the worst cases of mass hysteria history has ever seen. But as always, I'm going to leave that up to you to decide. You have a very, very happy, spooky Halloween, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.